Welcome to our program. This is the Al Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and its Bridge initiative. We will be holding a series of virtual programs this year, and I'm delighted that we have, I think, a superb author and book to kick it off. Peter Oborne is an award-winning writer, journalist, and broadcaster. He's worked for several newspapers, The Spectator, The Daily Mail, and The Daily Telegraph, where he was the chief political commentator. He's now with Middle East Eye. Peter sat as a commissioner for the Citizens Commission on Islam, Participation in Public Life, and is the author of numerous books. The Rise of Political Lying, A Dangerous Delusion, Why the West Was Wrong About Nuclear Iran, Wounded Tiger, How Trump Thinks, His Tweets and the Birth of a New Political Language, and the Sunday Times bestseller, The Assault of Truth. His most recent book, The Fate of Abraham, has also been a Sunday Times bestseller. Our approach will be for Peter to give his presentation. I will then introduce two discussants, and each of them will have a chance to speak, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So Peter, it's all yours.
Well, first of all, Professor, I want to say a word of thanks to you, to the Al Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and the Bridge Initiative. I just can't say how influential you've been on me for many, many years. What you've done is not just stand up for the highest standards of scholarship when it comes to the Islamic world, but you've also stood up for values which have been forgotten or actually challenged across so much of the West, including America, including Britain, and as we know, across a lot of Europe as well. It's been a really kind of hard struggle. You're a minority, and I so admire the courtesy and learning and gentle understanding which you and your colleagues and your institute have said about this, and how inspirational I have found your struggle against what is effectively a barbaric discourse, a bigoted discourse, which shows a complete misunderstanding, not just of Islam, but actually of religion, and not just of religion, of humanity and who we are. And so, actually, I think the whole world owes you a round of applause. I certainly do. I've tried to write this book in your tradition, which is to try and understand rather than to condemn, and try and challenge a number of ideas which have actually poisoned or polluted transatlantic discourse about Islam. And I set these ideas out. They've been mainly created or invented, these words and terms, I think, in order to categorize or to shape discourse about Islam and Muslims. Words like Islamism, which is so ambiguous. It's used by politicians on both sides of the Atlantic to mean maybe ISIS, maybe Al-Qaeda, in the same way as they use it as about political Islamic movements across North Africa, which are peaceful movements. And so you just it's been, I think, a deliberately misused word, at any rate, grotesquely misused word, to turn democratic political movements into what sounds very much like terrorist political movements. Another word I find has done great damage and has deliberately utilized to do so is extremism. It's constantly being used about voices which come from outside the mainstream and are being damned as extremist, even though the voices which condemn them might just as well be used as extremists. There's no legal definition of extremism. It's a positional term. It's a saying where you stand in relation to other people, but it's used to damn and keep out of public discourse voices which have and movements and communities which have an enormous role to play. Radicalization is another word which I look at hard in the book. Moderate, another one. It's a virtuous word when it comes to Muslims, but of course it's always an attack word when it comes to, in Britain at any rate, to white middle class politicians. If you want to damn a British politician as being second rate, you say, oh, he's rather moderate, or he's a moderate. If you want to praise a Muslim, you say he's or she is a moderate Muslim. And the word, many ways, the most pernicious word of all is, or phrase, it's a term, it's suddenly emerged in the last decade in Britain, is non-violent extremism, another variant of extremism. It is not, it's not, and what it is doing there is being used to create a kind of thought crime. And so even to express an opinion is being turned into an extremist, a sinister thing. It's the central concept which lies behind, and I'll talk about it a little in a moment or two, the prevent strategy in Britain, which is a form of surveillance of the Muslim community. It's very sinister. You have parallel things in the United States, in fact, but it's and the final thing I challenge is a phrase which, when it began to be used, had great nobility and contemporary relevance. This is the term Judeo-Christian tradition, which, when it started to enter mainstream discourse in the late 1930s and 1940s, it was an essential term to challenge the way in which the Christian world or Christian movements were starting to persecute, well, not starting, they've been doing it for hundreds of years, thousands of years, persecute Jews. And I think to link Christians and Jews in a common tradition was a wonderful thing to do. I searched for the first writer to use it. It seems I couldn't get further than George Orwell in a biography of Stendhal, in a review of a biography of Stendhal in about 1938. But and of course it had to be used, the word term Judeo-Christian tradition, at that time when the Nazi Holocaust was just beginning to get seriously underway. But it was then reused. It was reprocessed after World War II to fight the Cold War. And in recent years, and I don't think people have looked at this enough, it's being picked up by the far right. People like Steve Bannon has a centre for uses this term, Nigel Farage, the far right movements across Europe, and of course they're using it in order to demonize and as a scare word to exclude Muslims, exclude the Muslim communities who have largely arrived in Europe since the end of World War II, and the thesis is that this great noble European idea, the Judeo-Christian tradition, is under threat, under invidious threat from Islam. There's all kinds of conceptual problems with the term Judeo-Christian tradition, but it's actually being weaponized against a minority. And I think I think we should start to talk about the Abrahamic tradition, or the people of the book, as is talked about in the Quran, and we need to find other ways of engaging with that, because it's a term which has been created to divide. I also look at the consequences of the Clash of Civilizations thesis of Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis, who actually invented the term. And again, that is so much created in order to divide. It seems to me that there is an eerie symmetry between the neoconservatives and Al-Qaeda, the violent radical movements of Islam. Both of them falsely interpret Islam as a violent religion. They have the same interpretation. They both of them believe that it is okay to use force, as we saw in Iraq or in the Twin Towers. There's a source. They both of them affirm each other's worldview. They believe that we live in a world of conflict, and both of them actually share the same Marxist belief that the end justifies the means, that we are but in order to attain whatever it is that you want, whether it's American or democratic dominance of the globe, as the neocons might see it, or whether a perfect world of Sharia law, as Al-Qaeda might like it, they both believe that those ends are justified by violence, and so this is this tragic misinterpretation of the globe is shared by both the neocons and AQ, and perhaps by ISIS. And I try and explain that because, it seems to me that is we have that unholy alliance, as it were, explains so many of the misconceptions about Muslims which we have in the world now. I'm very gloomy about the future. If you look at the plight of Muslims across the globe, we are having a series of we have had two genocides in the last 25 years. We had the Srebrenica horror in July 1996, which was against the one remaining Muslim community in Europe. I went back there the other day, and it's denied by the local people, the Serbs who now control Srebrenica. The mayor of Srebrenica, he was just off to a prayer breakfast actually with President Trump, he told me, but he also told me that the genocide never took place, and that is, and if you deny it, if it's being denied, it may happen again. And then I went to, as I write about in the book, to Burma to Myanmar ahead of the genocide of the Rohingya, and it is horrible the way in which the Western governments, which claim to stand up for human rights, were standing up for the Aung San Suu Kyi's government at the time, actually condemning, actually supporting the Boris Johnson as foreign secretary. His foreign office actually supported the Burmese government and believed their fake narrative about provocation, and we are now seeing another, and this will be the most terrible, is Modi in India, where the West rushes to India, and we have the language of genocide being taught now in India, and the pogroms are starting. And Arundhati Roy, I do recommend, she wrote the Indian novelist, she wrote two phenomenal pieces which really struck me. Again, we have the complicity of nations which seem indifferent. Imagine if what was happening in India was happening in Britain. And I think there is a national indifference. Life is just ending with the state of affairs in Britain. I do a long study of the structural, how one should one say it, the language of Islamophobia, how it's been created deliberately by mass newspapers, the media, think tanks, politicians, all working together. I examine some of the witch hunts and hysterias of recent years, the fabricated Trojan horse affair. You know, it's so shaming for British journalism, but it took 7 years for anybody to have a look at it, and it was the people who did look at it with the New York Times in a remarkable podcast, and it's called Serial Productions Podcast, and the British media was so embedded in the narrative they can't get out of it that there was an Islamic plot to take over Muslim schools in Britain, that they turned viciously on the podcasters on the New York Times. I examine those kind of issues and the framing of grooming gangs, you know, the trope of violent Muslim men who sexually abuse Western women. It's a terrible, you can see these very dark themes emerging at the same time as a new, the government is moving to, the British government, and I think the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, it won't be long before she or her Home Secretary announced a new security architecture towards Muslims. This security architecture will have been created by think tanks largely, and sold to the mass media and to politicians. It's moving, and I talk about it a little bit more if people wanted to do this, towards creating almost the entire, every Muslim in Britain that becomes a suspect unless they disavow their Muslimness. And this, I show in the book, is entirely contrary to the relaxed, tolerant, multicultural British tradition. It just gives you a little flavor of the book. I don't want to talk for too long, except to say I'm so chuffed to be here.
Muqtedar Khan, first of all, is someone who has his PhD from Georgetown University, and was one of the first graduate students that I had the honor to work with. He's a brilliant scholar. He is in the Department of Political Science at the University of Delaware. He's been involved as the academic director for the State Department's National Security Institute. And he has been a prolific author. All you have to do is do a search in terms of his, not just his books, but his articles, which regularly address the contemporary situation. And also a good deal of his work has been on the internet, in which he comments on international affairs, not just the Middle East, not just the Muslim world, but more broadly, you know, on what's happening in the world. Dr. Nagwan Soliman is a senior fellow here at the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. She, prior to coming here, was at Harvard at Radcliffe College, and she works on jihadist movements and also the role of youth. And her work on jihadist movements is, a good deal of it is new and fresh, which is sometimes difficult to find and say. It's very much looking at the current situation. And she is at the National Endowment for Democracy, dealing with the MENA region, North Africa and the MENA region. So Muqtedar, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much, John. For those of you who don't know, John Esposito was my professor, and he was also on the chair of my dissertation committee, and he has been a mentor all my life, and so I'm happy to be here. I also want to congratulate Peter Oborne on this excellent book. I've been reading it. You can see how meticulously done book. It is excellent. It is not just, I thought it would be more of a post 9/11 history, of how the West has responded to 9/11 and what has happened with Muslims in the West. But actually, you often go back in history way into the past, and so really talk about the origins of the contacts of Islam in the West. So, for example, when you talk about the US, you talk about the initial relations and experience that the US and the American community had with Islam and Muslims. The book is excellent, and I recommend it. And you're right, it is very much in what I call as the John Esposito school of thought. So I strongly recommended it, and I think it will be also a good book to use at undergraduate level for those who teach courses around Islam in the West, or even Islam in the West. The book has 3 interesting case studies, basically, about how the West has responded to Islam, especially America, Britain, and France. And there are lots of interesting nuggets in the book. But I don't know whether Peter Oborne knows that another name for academics is nitpickers. So that's what I'm going to do for the rest of the 5 or 6 minutes. Otherwise, I would not be true to my nature of being an academic. So I'm going to do some nitpicking. Number one, my story is missing from this. My life was completely transformed on 9/11. I had absolutely no interest in even doing as much work I did on Islam. I wanted to be a philosopher and did a political philosophy and Islamic philosophy. I thought I would be spending the rest of my life arguing with Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, but I ended up arguing with Daniel Pipes and Bernard Lewis for the rest of the 25 years, and that was because I think 9/11 hijacked my life. So it happened to a lot of Muslims in the West. Their life trajectories were changed, and they responded to the Western response to Islam. And it led to creation of various institutions, and also to some extent even reform of Islam in the West, and Muslims started thinking about Islam differently. So I think that's one part of the story that is missing. It is very clear that there is another one coming, part 2, and so perhaps it could be in that. The story also, I think, does not recognize the positive side of the story. So, for example, if you look at the case of Islam in the West after 9/11, we have now 3 American Muslims in the US Congress. 2 of them are women, and 1 of them is hijabi. So each item is an interesting aspect. And the battles to keep Ilhan Omar in the Congress are both telling what you are telling about the rise of Islamophobia in the West, but also telling the other side of the story that she wins, and she wins with the support of the growing strength of Muslims in the West and the allies that they have with them. So it's not, Ilhan Omar cannot just win with the support of American Muslims. And now there's also criticism of Ilhan Omar because of her position on LGBTQ. So in the elections starting now, she's going to lose some Muslim vote also because of her progressive politics. So this aspect of the story is clearly missing. The positive, and I think there are lots of positive things to say. The second thing is that I was at the Islamic Society of North America's conference this weekend. I came back last night, and because I was going to review this book, so I did talk to a lot of American Muslim leaders on and off the record about whether they genuinely felt that Islamophobia has receded in America. Most of the people I spoke to were mostly all of them were American Muslims, and they did say that, yes, we can tell you that Islamophobia today is not as intense it was, say, 10 years ago. And some were also, kind of cynical. Some of them said, well, thank God for the white nationalists, that now that finally America has recognized the rise of the dangers of Christian nationalism and white nationalism in this country, people are beginning to realize that there is extremism in America, and so the spotlight has shifted from Muslims to white nationalists. And And let me tell you how you can tell that is because of this episode with this young Muslim male who attacked Salman Rushdie in a horrendous attack and tried to kill him. There was some coverage of it in the media, but imagine this happening 10 years ago, the kind of stories it would have generated in the media. We did not see that. And so I think that's partly because of the spotlight that has shifted to January 6th and the fact that it has exposed, and also some events such as the killings in Scandinavia and in New Zealand, where white nationalists have massacred large numbers of especially Muslims in Christchurch, that also shows that Muslims themselves are victims of Western terrorism in the West. And that's an interesting aspect too. Sometimes you have done where you highlight the language of the West and how it demonizes Islam and Muslims, and then assert that it will lead to violence, but then the examples that you give are from the East. So for example, on, I could actually tell you, on page 21, for example, you talk about, except for Bosnia, all the other examples are from Asia, Myanmar, Uyghurs, India, etc. So these are all non-Western countries which are in the various stages of committing genocidal violence against Muslims. But the language that you cite is Western, and only the Bosnian case is. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the automatic assumption that there is going to be violence as a result of the language that is used about Islam and Muslims needs examples for justification. And I think the violence from the West is coming by the countries. The examples are the invasion of Iraq, for example, is probably the best example of how. And sometimes in heated arguments, I point out the fact that one of the reasons why so many Muslims resort to violence, like joining ISIS and Al-Qaeda, is because their countries are not doing that for them. So basically, they're going with faith-based NGOs to do violence. But if their countries were doing violence, then they would not need to do that. So because Western countries indulge in whole-scale violence against Muslim countries, the first thing that every president does, it's like a tradition now, bomb some Muslim country, including Biden. The first thing he did was to bomb Syria. And that's what Trump did, dropped the mother of all bombs on Syria. So every American president wages war or attacks in some Muslim country. So Americans don't need to, start some organization to go and kill Muslims. Their governments seem to be doing a pretty good job of it. So that is an interesting point that I wanted to bring to your notice. And then this issue of, you do emphasize the concept of Judeo-Christian identity a lot. And if you remember, before 9/11, Bill Clinton in his State of the Union address was beginning to talk about mosques, churches, and synagogues. And there have been instances where he sometimes even mentioned mosques first and then churches and synagogues. And so at that time, this is just before 9/11, 2 or 3 years before, American Muslims were very proud because we had started talking about the Abrahamic tradition rather than the Judeo-Christian being the basis of American identity. So we felt that we had transformed the way Americans were thinking about America. So instead of thinking of America as Judeo-Christian, which excluded Muslims, by thinking of it as Abrahamic, we were including Muslims. Now, in fact, I problematize Abrahamic because then it excludes Buddhists, atheists, and even Hindus, who are now quite significant in numbers and presence. And finally, I do want to point out that things have changed dramatically. One of my dream jobs would have been in this country to be the head of policy planning in the State Department, but there's no way I'm going to clear any confirmation hearings. But guess what? The head of policy planning at the moment is an American Muslim. His name is Salman Ahmed. So that is a very critical position. So probably the fact that an American Muslim is head of policy planning at the State Department would kind of throw a wrench into the argument that the Western foreign policies are not necessarily made are necessarily anti-Western. Now they are being made and articulated. In fact, Biden's entire concept of middle-class foreign policy in his entire campaign, which was emphasized again and again, was Salman Ahmed's idea, and that's why he was brought in to become the director of policy planning. But otherwise, the fact that there is violence on the Muslim side too, there was so much of violence in Paris and others, that part of the story is untold. But your story about how the West talks about Islam, how there is sometimes instinctive dislike, contempt, and even hatred towards Muslims and Islam, the story has been said very beautifully. You write very clearly, quite beautifully. So I think it is an excellent book, and I would recommend everybody to read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muqtedar. Nagwan Soliman.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be with you. Thank you very much, Professor Esposito, for kind invitation, and congratulations for your book, Mr. Peter Oborne. I see your book is very excellent. I share what Professor Khan mentioned about the language that he uses. It's accessible language, not only for academics, but for non-academics, and most importantly, for journalists and policymakers, because those people who we need them to read this kind of work and to learn more about how the problems and how the Western talk about Islam, or the policies that use it against Muslim and Christian Muslims in their countries, citizens, and also Muslim world outside. I see your book is its valuable contribution to the debate about the media and Islam. And you in your book actually provided sharp criticism to journalists who distorted the image of Islam and Muslims inside their countries and outside of countries. And this kind of book and this kind of contribution that I see it, excellent contribution, it actually goes in line with a lot of works has done by scholars like Edward Said and his important book that published in 1981 about covering Islam. So your book actually is contributed in this kind of debate and discussion about how Western media distort, or how Western media shape the image of Islam and Muslims in their media and their work. Also, I see your book, The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam, as a valuable contribution, because you provide a sharp criticism to some Western governments and give some examples. And I share what Professor Khan mentioned. Sometimes you give a good example, sometimes you need to put more examples from what's going on inside the countries. And here I see also you give this sharp criticism about the policies of Western countries, and when they're dealing with their citizens, and also when they're dealing with the Muslim world. You mentioned in some you mentioned in your book, for example, very important statement, but I didn't see more explanation about it. And I always say, like, this kind of discussion, online discussion, and the discussing of the book give a chance to the author to give more information and explanation, clarifications about what he wrote in the book. So, for example, you mentioned many credible analysts in the Arab world hold the US responsible for creating the condition that allowed terror groups such Al-Qaeda to flourish. And here my question to you, how, and from your perspective, how these conditions, how the government policies in some Western countries actually contribute to this kind of the flourish of terror groups. And also you mentioned very important point about, like, some of Arab leaders have dedicated significant resources to fueling suspicion about Islam, or of Islam, quote. And here also, it's time for you to give more examples and more clarification why and how they do this, this kind of, or how they contribute to distort Islam, and how to use this and when dealing with Islam and Muslims. So I see your book is important, and I see it's contributing to the debate. And I see particularly your book, it's contributed in the two aspects, the working with the journalists and also criticizing the policies of governments. And this kind of criticism or sharp criticism to governments, actually, we saw it in different work of scholars. And on the top of these scholars, Professor Esposito, in his book that published in 27, Who Speaks for Islam and What a Billion Muslim really think. So your book, I see, excellent book. And I also recommend my students and our students in Georgetown University and other universities to have a chance to read it and to discuss it in depth with them, with their professors and with us, and also with you. Thank you very much for your contribution and congratulations once more.
Thank you. Thank you, Nagwan. And back to you, Peter.
Oh yeah, I'll briefly, by the way, it was a terrifying experience of being torn to shreds by two such distinguished scholars, and I'll do my best. And actually, I very much value these criticisms. The best thing you can ever have in life is being criticized. It's not praise, because you learn from criticism. But to start with Dr. Muqtedar, my life too was changed as a journalist by 9/11. Not as a Muslim, obviously, but it was what drove me ultimately to write this book, was the emergence of this very ugly discourse in the West. I do look at the way, I do say actually at the end of the American section that the situation in the United States is getting happier. And I do cite, I think they're called the Quad, aren't they? And I like this new more, and I do agree with you that there is a new, actually China, A, white supremacists, and B, China and so on, as a new kind of, to quote a word which doesn't mean anything, existential threat. And it has lifted some of the pressure. On your point about white supremacy, I think you're right about the States. In Britain, it's different. And it's very fascinating, and it frightens me. We're just about to have the announcement, as I said, of a new security architecture. The driving forces behind it are think tanks with transatlantic links. One is Policy Exchange, and one is the Henry Jackson Society. And there is a cleansing. I'm trying to find the right word. The argument, they're trying to almost define anybody who challenges government policy towards Muslims as extremists. This is the objective, and they've set it out. And they're also, and adoption of Muslim language or Muslim ideas or support for Palestine and things like that are increasingly being framed as extremists, whereas, shall we say, far-right language is being brought in and domesticated and made acceptable. And this is something which is happening in Britain as a reinforcement of the prevent strategy. The announcements haven't happened yet, but the review of this prevent strategy, which is a system of state-sponsored surveillance of Muslims, every sign is that it's sort of saying the prevent is no longer going to be interested in far-right extremism because those are legitimate concerns expressed by ordinary people, but they are worried about these Muslims. And I'd love to stay in touch with you on that and argue the point, because it does concern me. I mean, it really scares me. But I do really take your point that 6th of Jan has really changed. Very briefly, I mean, Muslims are victims of Western terrorism. Christchurch was a terrible moment, and as I wrote in the book, it had the killer had 4 Rotherham written on his bullets, and that was the construction of that grooming gang narrative going global. And that's one of the ways. I do devote section 4 of the book to showing how the environment for Muslims has changed in Britain as the emergence of a new language, of the prevent strategy, and a sustained and ferocious press attacks has changed the experience of Muslims, perhaps more than in the United States. Again, I could show you more material on that. Now, and then the question from Nagwan. Let me. How you felt that the first? I wrote down two key points you were making. One was the fueling of suspicion of Islam by Muslim governments, isn't that right? I think. And the second one, can you remind me of the question? How I wrote down how government policies flourish.
Yeah, you mentioned in page number 375, many credible analysts where it holds the US responsible for creating the condition that allowed terror groups such as Al-Qaeda to flourish. Now my question to you, from your perspective, how do you see, or how the United States or Western governments flourish this kind of or provide the conditions that pave the route for flourishing of these groups?
Yeah, it's a central part of the book. This is a central argument of the book, which is the use. I talked about this language which has been created. Another bad word is terrorism, which has been abused and abused again and again to define a political opponent rather than somebody who uses violence. And I examined the system of alliances between Western governments and Arab dictatorships across North Africa and the Gulf states. Now, the opposition to these dictatorships, whether it's Egypt or UAE or Tunisia, the three examples I look at, and others, are political Islam, generally speaking. That's not always, but and they are democratic movements, but they are not. They're very frequently not allowed rights of assembly, not allowed freedoms to protest, and not allowed newspapers. And they are defined as terrorist movements again and again. The classic case, and that means that Al-Qaeda is able. And you look at Al-Qaeda literature, again and again, they will say the West is completely cynical about democracy. And this goes back, to the Iranian coup d'etat jointly arranged by MI6 and the CIA in 1953, where you have a democratically elected government, Mossadegh, and it's got rid of by the West in its naked self-interest. Sisi is another case in point, where you have a democratically mandated Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt, and it's got rid of a coup happens. This one wasn't, this one was more to do, I should think, with more sponsored in the Gulf states, but the message, but then sanctioned by the West, and the message to people who believe there is a democratic future in the Middle East is there isn't one. The West won't permit it. And then Al-Qaeda, well, what do? You can't fight democratically for your rights and for your identity. Al-Qaeda comes along and says the only real battle is violence. So I think that's my answer to your question, and there's a literature on this. And these states, UAE, a classic case in point, because their opponents are political Islam. They really need to do reputational damage. So there's an extraordinary noise is coming on the street. Do reputational damage to their political opponents. So they spend quite a lot of money, and I send you documents published in this country where they have showing how they have run expensive political campaigns to demonize their own political opposition as terrorists. A very, very serious matter. It's one of the great betrayals of everything which the West stands for in terms of democracy and freedom.
I would just, before we open it up to questions, just mention that what I found a lot in the book, very, very significant and worthwhile because of the extent to which you plowed into it, and therefore, for example, dealing with European and American colonialism, neo-colonialism, and the track record. Um, uh, it was almost like my response to Bernard Lewis with his book "What Went Wrong." Bernard, you went wrong. Well, when one looks at European and American neo-colonialism and really looks at it in terms of what it was really like, one can then understand the extent to which its legacy was so very, very significant. The negative side of that legacy. I also think that one needs to be aware, if one looks at, for example, ISPU's latest poll, it certainly sees the success of Muslims, most or many Muslims, economically, educationally, etc., and the growth of that. But it also notes that among the poorest in the country are Muslims, and that with all that success, that very often Muslims are 5 times more likely than others to be stopped or questioned, or etc. And we continue to have those situations. A fair number of them now just don't show up in our media, but you still have a fair number of them. But I noticed that we have a number of people in the Q&A and also someone in chat. So I'll turn it over to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Professor. And here's the first question. This question is from Joel Teitenbaum. Joel says, is China's oppression of the Uyghur population and Islamic faith in Western China actually a form of genocide? If not, what should it be called? I believe this is for Peter.
Yeah, it's certainly a cultural genocide. Whether it has reached the stage where it should be called an actual genocide, I don't think the facts are absolutely established. I do recommend, by the way, I recommend it in my reading. There's a phenomenal book on what is happening at the moment to the Uyghurs, which is one of the great crimes going on in the world today. That book I cannot recommend too highly. I find it absolutely gripping, and it did show how the Chinese were able to rather horrifically show how the Chinese were able to deploy George W. Bush and Tony Blair's war on terror in order to wage war on its own citizens, the Uyghurs. Where I'm now not fine. Yeah, it's in my further reading. I give this book, which is just gone. Sean Roberts, S-E-A-N Roberts, The War on the Uyghurs, makes this point very clear, and it really, it's a horrifying book, and I really recommend it.
All right, we have another question here. This one is from Chris Wagner. Chris Wagner says, to which extent do you see Islamophobia as a possible placeholder to find a scapegoat for other serious problems?
Yeah, I think I could write a book about that. I mean, you only have to look at the astonishing outbursts of ferocious anti-Muslim fabrications in the United States leading up to Trump's wall, which was really a metaphor. It wasn't about Muslims at all. It was a metaphor for all of the insecurities of probably poorer United States voters. There was no threat from Islam to the United States of any kind at all, but it's how he won votes. And if you look at Hungary as another case where there's virtually no Muslims at all, but Oborne asserts himself by creating and almost inventing a Muslim menace. And so a lot of I don't want to go into the psychoanalysis or sort of psychopathology of Islamophobia, because I'm not really qualified to do it. But it's again and again, you find Islamophobes, rather like Joe McCarthy and communism, very similar. Joe McCarthy and communism in the 1950s, there wasn't a communist threat. Joe McCarthy fabricated everything. It was bought into by many, like by Nixon and many other politicians who should have known better. And it wasn't about communism ultimately. It was about deep tapping into the grievances and insecurities of normally of poorer and less well-educated voters.
So we have another question here. This is from Shahradzan Kablan. Sorry if I mispronounced the name. How do scholars influence the gloomy current political situation in dealing with the MENA region? What is the role as well of youth within this conversation?
I always, it's very annoying. I think of myself at about 25 years old. Actually, I'm 65. And I always think that the young people I meet, wherever they may be, are much more promising and nicer people than we were at that age, and more informed. And so I think youth, our generation, I don't know if John would agree with me, has messed up the world. And it's for the current youth of today to put it back together again. And I'm afraid we've left you with some really terrible problems. Now, scholars is a slightly different point. I mean, they're very rare scholars who are great scholars and are able to project their scholarship and educate a generation. And one of them we have here is John Esposito, who has played such a role, as I said at the start, as educating America, not just America, and the West, about another way of seeing Islam and a more truthful way. Scholarship is about truth and asking questions and not being afraid to ask questions. And then very slowly, you can have an enormous impact. It's not that it tends not to be an immediate impact, unless, like Henry Kissinger, perhaps, you go off into the world of policy and politics.
We have a couple of other questions. This one from Salam Al-Mariati. Salam says, this is a very informative on Western misconceptions of Islam. They plan to order the book to use it in their own work. Their question is, what do Muslims get wrong about the West? Could you give us 2 examples, even if it's not empirical? If you can, please answer for both Muslims living in the West and for those in Muslim majority countries.
Well, I'll give you an example, if you like, from last week. I was in Iran, and I went to Iran. It's quite hard to go there as a Western journalist these days, just because so many false narratives exist about Iran. But Iran doesn't get everything right. And I went to interview, a very interesting interview with a very well-informed, immaculately courteous newspaper editor, and we talked about the Salman Rushdie business. And he said, well, and it was not long after the terrible attempt to kill Rushdie, and he justified the fatwa. He said, you know, this is what we stand for. The Prophet Muhammad is sacred to us, and you cannot attack him. But he wouldn't accept he wouldn't accept that it was absolutely terrible to try and murder Salman Rushdie. I'm not saying he's speaking for all of Iran or all of certainly not speaking for all of Islam, but that's an example of where there are misunderstandings. I tend to think, though, that there are not more than misunderstandings, and it's a terrible thing to say. I mean, absolutely shocking, abominable thing to defend Salman Rushdie and the attempt to kill Salman Rushdie and the man who tried to kill him. But I also think that Muslims get a lot of things right about the West. We are too, how should we say it, consumerist. We're too fond of money. we're too fond of the short term, and we're too fond of, we're not religious enough. I don't mean by, religion has so many things to teach us. So I think that, and the other thing is because of the way the Muslims love lots of, you always get people fascinated by the West, but of course they get lots of things completely wrong about the West, but boy, do they get some of things right. If you want to understand Western foreign policy, it's very helpful to spend 6 months traveling around the Middle East. You get a completely different perspective than you do reading the columns of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times.
Thank you.
I'm well aware I haven't come up with a second example. So I will try and do that before the end of this. Yeah.
We do have some other questions. So this question is from Priscilla Kim. Priscilla says, how do you think we can change the narrative around Muslims in the West? Do you have any idea on how to diffuse US and British security policies towards Islamic countries, as an example?
Well, I think there is some, Western foreign policy has been a nightmare. It's responsible for so much that has gone wrong. If you think back 30 years, when the fall of the Soviet Union, we were collectively in a position to do so much good, instead of which we went on this rampage across the Middle East and the rest of the world. And so I don't, how do you diffuse it? I think, and I'm a conservative writer, by the way. I've written for sort of papers like The Spectator and the Telegraph and the Daily Mail in Britain. I'm increasingly coming to the conclusion that the analysis of the left is far more interesting when it comes to confronting the foreign policy of the United States. And you have to fight it politically. And it's through common effort. Now, how you challenge what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. I don't absolutely know, but the ultimate answer is politically, and the right has no interest in this. There is very little interest in this. It's the left which is most hopeful. Jimmy Carter's my hero, and he's about as left-wing as you go in the United States.
Thank you so much. We have a couple more questions coming in, and we definitely still have time for more. So if anyone out there does have a question that you'd like be addressed, please put it into the Q&A section. So this question is from Ori Soltes. Ori says, wonderful presentation and discussion. I would love to hear your thoughts on Fethullah Gulen and the persecution by Erdogan of anyone cagedly associated with this individual.
I just don't know enough about that. I'm sorry. It's best if I don't engage in things I haven't really become an expert in.
Excellent. We have a question from Amber Knowles. Amber says, you spoke clearly and interestingly about genocide at the beginning of the talk and stated, if genocide is denied, it may happen again. Therefore, what would you suggest we do to address the recent Muslim genocide as what has been done in China to the Uyghurs? Would you recommend atrocity trials? What's a way to curb this behavior by a superpower?
I think China's particularly, the Uyghurs is, we don't have the military muscle barring a sort of Third World War to confront China over the Uyghurs. We can use, and I don't suggest that it would be I think it would just make matters far, far worse if we sort of tried to arm an insurgency. So I would discourage, I would think that's a very bad idea. I think morals persuasion, but it's very unlikely to have any real effect. Of course, we do have mechanisms like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, but Tommy, explain to me somehow how you're going to get President Xi to the ICC. I don't think you are. So I really don't know. I think you should write about it. I think you can put pressure on China. In some ways, turning China into some sort of existential enemy of the West anyway makes it more difficult. The more interesting case, I think, is, I mean, more interesting in the sense that we can have more influence, is the move towards genocide in India, which is closer to the West and where we would have more influence. And I think we can do things there. For instance, I would be very happy if Facebook were to desist from, as it seems to be doing, publishing sort of hate speech aimed at Muslims. I think that I can't understand why a great Western company does that.
Would you care to go into that a bit, as someone who myself finds interesting the limitations that a platform like Facebook may feel that they have on curbing speech? Do you feel there is a role for private social media companies to mitigate hate speech when this speech could result in someone, losing their lives or being threatened?
Well, Facebook have done this before in Myanmar, remember. That algorithm encourages clicks, doesn't it? It likes activity. So these inflammatory remarks made by populist demagogues, they're good for Facebook. They make money for Facebook, and I think that Facebook has a real kind of moral duty to examine itself. The other problem which Facebook has is, whereas in the United States, where and perhaps in Britain, where these culture wars which we are engaged with about gender, etc., these are very carefully monitored, and there's lots of people policing the traffic. It's much less. They have far less people policing traffic in India, or I don't know if they're operating in China or not.
We have one more question here. This question is from Chris Wagner. This question is: you often cite Western scholars to support your perspectives. Who would be some non-European scholars working on these topics that you'd also recommend?
Actually, I have lots. In fact, I drew heavily. Yes, you're right. I cite Professor Esposito and lots of other wonderful. There is a small band of wonderful scholars in the West. Professor, who wrote Good Muslim, Bad Muslim? I find that a very good, very helpful book. I'm just trying to remember his name. I find, and he perhaps he's now gone. He was in Ghana or somewhere like that when he wrote.
You thinking of Mamdani?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
I found
that
perspective very enlightening when I was learning. I got a long further reading list at the back of the book. I mean, as I say, the Indian novelist Arundhati Roy I found very helpful in understanding Narendra Modi and the kind of looming problem, terrible problems in India. And a lot of Muslim writers who I've drawn on. And in Britain, there's a very exciting new writer who comes from Sudan originally, Nesreen Malik, and you find her writing for the Guardian newspaper. I find her very helpful, and I think she's just written a book, We Need New Stories, challenging the toxic myths behind the age of discontent, which is highly relevant to this conversation. Fawaz Gerges is a Lebanese, I think, but his Rise and Fall of Al-Qaeda is a sensationally interesting. It's a little bit out of date, but it's a phenomenal book. I mean, Tausif Khan in Britain has just written a fantastic book, The Muslim Problem. Again, trying to sort of analyzing the false narratives told about Muslims. I mean, there's lots of other. Oh, and there's one wonderful book, Akbar Ahmed, who is the Pakistan's resident in Baluchistan, I think, and his book, The Thistle and the Drone. Have you read that book? It's a meditation on the war on terror, and analyzes the war on terror as a battle between national governments in the Muslim world, backed by Western power, against tribal peoples. Hence the thistle. He draws heavily on the analogy with the Scottish tribes in the 18th century, first half of the 18th century, who were eliminated by the British after Culloden. And these noble, it's maybe a little bit romantic, but he's got personal experience, and he argues that the war on terror is really aimed not, and he looks at Yemen very, very carefully, and argues that Al-Qaeda is essentially a Yemeni phenomenon, not a Saudi phenomenon. It's a tribal phenomenon, a whole set of different values. And so I find his work extremely valuable. As well as books like, there's a book called The Quran, written by a well-known Arabic prophet in the 7th century after Christ. And books like that contain, and the hadiths of the prophet, are increasingly found very, very valuable in understanding. You have to go back a very long way, you know what I mean, to get the hang of what's going on, and a lot of wisdom and truth in books like that. I can go on. I mean, I have a reading list. Writing this book was a real personal education in all sorts of things, in religion, in truth, in history, in current affairs.
So we have one more question. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we have one more question, and this is about your book. This is from Priscilla Kim. How have people responded in generally to your book, and how have you dealt with those responses?
Yeah, I've been very disappointed not by the it's in Britain as I really look at the press and their role in spreading smears and witch hunts, fueling witch hunts against Muslims. Particularly, I go after Rupert Murdoch because and you know him in this country, in your country, Fox News, and the Times newspaper, the Sun newspaper, the Sunday Times, but also the other papers groups, because they all have a severe Islamophobic agenda. So the book's hardly, not very surprisingly, it's almost been ignored in the mainstream British newspapers. The best review, the most interesting review, was actually in the Church Times in Britain, which is an Anglican publication, and it didn't surprise me because at least they took a religion serious. The BBC, again, you've got to look at the BBC. The BBC's ignored it, wouldn't have me on. There's been very little coverage, and I think that's wrong. I think it shows a narrowing of discourse. They're not asking people to agree with me, but the central themes of the book are challenging the central narrative about Muslims in Britain and at the moment. And rather than people discussing it and engaging with it and saying, they're just ignoring it. And that's quite, and I don't think that would have happened in the 30 years ago. It's something about, and it's true of the West as well, that there are only certain ideas which are enabled and allowed by the mass media and by government.
I think that's a problem that one sees, at least in my experience, in America and in Europe. I mean, they're kind of a clutch of people who really take on these kinds of issues and manage to be in print. But by and large, that's not the case. And it recalls something. We had a program here now quite a few years ago with people from the Washington Post, a number of major media people. And so one of the people in the audience, a Muslim, said, why is it that the coverage is so overwhelmingly negative? Why don't you write about, as it were, the moderate situation, etc.? And the response from a lead editor, somebody who went on to be a very successful author and a critical writer, but also from others, was, the almost classic statement: if it bleeds, it leads. And that it's that which dominates. And if you actually look at, for those that are watching this now or will be watching our recording, if you go to Media Tenor, which is based in Europe, and they monitor Europe, the US, and even globally, but certainly on this issue, Europe and the US, you can see over the years the incredible increase in Islamophobia and why. And a lot of it has to do with media coverage, the percentage of emphasis on violence and extremism versus the percentage which often remains constant and low on what the vast majority of Muslims are, or are not. Well, we've had an excellent program. I wanted to have the best of possible programs to lead off, and the discovery of your book made that possible. I'm somebody who's not only read the book, but has also listened to the audio, and I normally don't listen to audio books, but I would suggest that, and it's a very good audio rendition. The only problem with it is that one gets too engrossed listening to what you're saying, and at times misses where you need to get off as you're driving. I found that was the only problem. But I think that, just a final comment, I think that one can also count on the fact that the way in which you talk about, again, I'm getting back to, British, French, American colonialism, neo-colonialism, and then even what comes after, that kind of message, unfortunately, does not get the same kind of traction, than it should. And so, I mean, I can think of, for example, a number of prominent media personalities, newspaper people, etc., who have great reputations, but when they go to write about Islam and Muslims, they get published because, they say things like, why didn't Muslims speak out when 9/11 occurred? Or why don't Muslims do X or Y? When in fact they should know better. So I think that there's a kind of skewed, approach there. I want to thank you, Peter, for spending this time with us, and especially for, I haven't been this enthusiastic about a book in ages. And I want to thank those that have participated today, Muqtedar Khan and Nagwan and Andrew, for your help. And I want to note that this is being recorded, and we will be distributing it widely on YouTube, Bridge on Facebook, where we have 1.1 million followers, and in other venues. So this will certainly have traction and a life after this particular program. Thank you all, and I hope to see you when we have our next program. And thank you, Peter.
Thank you very, very much indeed for having me on. I really enjoyed myself, and thank you. I felt very honored as well. Thank you.